Thank you, Tiffany, for being here. Really appreciate it. Without further ado, I just want to do a great introduction to this fantastic book, which is totally fine. But before that, we'll just obviously introduce the wonderful writer herself, which is Tiffany Philippou, who is a podcaster, as of course, as well as a writer, and her writing has been published in Stylist, Refinery 29, Sifted, The Eye Paper, and The Startup, and she co-hosts the work Life and Happiness podcast, Is This Working? Now, and it's also been described, I've heard, by The Guardian as increasingly vital, which obviously, especially in modern day culture, I think with the loneliness of work, it's really, really important. So the podcast is number one. It's actually number one in the Apple UK careers charts and is actually frequently talked about in the top three in the business charts as well. And she also writes a weekly newsletter about love, loss, finding meaning, and some of the messier sides of life called the Tiff Weekly. She previously spent over 10 years working in leadership and specifically in startups. And in addition to her work as a writer and podcaster, she works as a consultant and recruiter for startups. And we're talking about her book, Totally Fine and Other Lies I've Told Myself, What My Decade in Grief Taught Me About Life. So thank you so much, Tiffany, for being here, first of all.
Thank you so much. And what a lovely introduction. Thank you.
So yes, exactly. So how did you feel about writing your story and sharing it with the world? Because obviously it's such a brutal story in so many aspects.
Yeah, it's a very personal story. So it's the story of my boyfriend's suicide when we were 20-year-old university students. And I go back in that story and look for answers to try and understand why he did it. And then I also go forward with regards to how my grief impacted me for 10 years and throughout my 20s. So it was very it was a very difficult exercise, but I felt like it was important. So much of so many of our problems in general as human beings is around shame and the shame that we feel and experience. And my experience of suicide grief is there is so much shame around it, and it's something that people don't really talk about. And so it felt like it was an important thing to do as well. So I was very much motivated by almost to expose myself, or I think I said once, like, sacrifice myself on the altar of dignity for a wider cause. And that cause is just to help anyone who has been bereaved by suicide perhaps feel less like I did at the time. Perhaps it's just helpful to hear someone else's story. But of course it was terrifying and difficult, but very healing as well, to go through that process of really staring in the face the biggest fears and the things I was most afraid to take a look at from my past.
Yeah, do you know, it's so incredible that you've just said that, because literally my second question was surrounding the shame, which is, so could you describe like how you experienced that shame, especially after experiencing such a horrible and sad situation? So how did it manifest itself?
Yeah, so Brené Brown is a hero of mine, talks a lot about shame, and I discovered her work pretty late on, with regards to when I was on that 10-year grief journey that is tracked in the book. But she very much talks about how shame is, so guilt might be I did a bad thing, whereas shame is I'm a bad person. And shame really fosters in silence, and it builds its power in what's not said. And anything in life, what gets left unsaid builds in power. And we so often try and suppress and pretend things are fine, which is why the book's called Totally Fine. And that makes it worse because it festers the more you push it down. So for me, it was important to, well, the biggest cure for that shame is very much to talk about it and tell everyone that story, and to break it out into the open as well. So that's why that's why I wanted to kind of do that in a very public setting.
I'm gonna say, yeah, it's very brave. I'm like, yeah, it's such a wound, isn't it, to just kind of dig into. And what I mean, it might sound like such a sort of ridiculous question, but what did you find as the worst aspect of grief?
This aspect of grief, Multiple ones are popping into my head, but the first one that came to me, I think, which I've spoken to a lot of people who've had experience of grief, is there's something about not feeling legitimate in your pain,
Mm.
or did that relate? So the magnitude of how you experience it and react to it doesn't feel legitimate. So I was young, we'd only been in each other's lives for 2 and a bit years. I was his girlfriend. I wasn't, it wasn't wife or family member, and so on and so forth. So there's something about not feeling legitimate. And again, I think that is about shame as well, right? Like, I don't deserve, why am I reacting like this? Um, but I've spoken to loads of people who've experienced grief in with all sorts of connections and people and circumstances, not necessarily suicide, who felt that as well. And there's something, it's very lonely, that I think.
Yeah, no, that definitely is. It just reminded me of that quote, isn't it? Grief is that thing with feathers, isn't it? It is really something. So, do you think your experiences actually helped you to sort of spur you on to do your business? Do you think maybe you would have chosen a completely different life path if things were different?
Yes, possibly. My whole writing career really launched with the first chapter of the book. Um, and from that, once I started writing it, it was a very long process from I went to a memoir class pretty much on a whim with no intention to write this story. And it came out almost, it was obviously bursting to come out.
Mm.
It was on a whim. And then because I started doing that and working on that over for a few years, it takes so long to go through that process, get an agent, deal, etc., etc. I began, like basically blogging a bit more, joining Substack, writing, pitching. So it really unlocked writing for me. So there's also something I think as well about when you have an experience that's so dark and difficult, it builds your own desire to find meaning and purpose in life, and also builds on your empathy around other people's experiences as well. So
Mm.
it's completely, if this hadn't happened to me, I would be a different person who'd be doing something different right now. And it's quite a scary, strange thought.
Yeah, it is. And one thing I really found fascinating was sort of the almost the dissociative aspect of it, where you couldn't embody yourself, which is why all the exercise and trying to find a way to sort of embody yourself. And how much of your physical reaction was trauma based, do you think?
Yeah, I think a huge amount of it was trauma based. I certainly am learning a lot more about trauma now than I was when I was writing the book. So I think what is in the book, it is very much like a narrative, how it's told. It's not sort of academic or scientific or brings in external. I almost wanted it to read a bit like a novel, and for something to be almost enjoyable, or people sometimes feel uncomfortable saying that, oh, I really enjoyed reading it because it's such an intense subject matter. But I felt like if it wasn't that, then people might not want to read it, because there is so much, like, do you want to read a book about suicide? I mean, that's a scary prospect for people, which I completely understand. So I think now I'm learning more about trauma and the body and how it holds it. Absolutely, there's a huge amount of trauma in there that I'm only seeing in retrospect, and when I speak to people like you who are asking me about it. And there's gaps in my memory as well. So people, my editor, or I think when I was interviewed, I think the Times reviewed it and they said, oh, we wanted more of Richard, who was my boyfriend who had died. We wanted more of the relationship. We want more. We want more. And I didn't have that much more to give. And I think that is related to trauma. And then I felt bad about that. So I obviously stirred up lots of difficult feelings, because I just couldn't really fully give as much as maybe people would like. And so, yeah, I think, but I'm learning more about trauma now and
Oh
how it
no,
impacts us.
you should give what you can. I'm like, after all, you're putting yourself out there, and I think, a lot of that is a sort of a survival mechanism to just cope with what you can, which is why your brain just sort of shuts down some aspects because it's too difficult to cope with. So it makes total sense that you might have memory gaps. And, so would you say the decade that you spent, you talk about in the book, was a form of self-punishment?
Yeah, I think so. I felt a lot of blame for what happened. I felt very judged by people around me because we lived together, we spent every day together. How could she not have known? And part of the exercise of the book is to kind of look for warning signs that this was going to happen. And even though they came out in the book a bit, when I went back and did analysis, at the time it still felt like a massive shock. And I was so young. It was also a different era.
Mm.
This is 2008. The world was not talking about mental health or mental illness or anything along those lines at that time. And so, yeah, I felt, I think self-punishment and exane, it's that shame thing. It's like, I'm not worthy. I'm a bad person, all these sorts of things. And it was, yeah, as you said, I kind of tried to numb. It felt like I wasn't really living. Yeah, I was just like numbing instead of confronting what I was actually feeling.
Gosh, it's hard because I can when I was reading it, I could feel it. I could feel the pain. The pain is there. But it's just, you can see it's just suppressed. And do you feel like your grief has changed over time then? Has it like mutated in different ways?
It's become a lot more manageable. Yes, certainly. It definitely comes back a lot. And perhaps maybe when suffering about other aspects, it's something that always kind of I come back to, and it pops up when, not necessarily when you least expect it, but it does come back quite a lot. But it's certainly, particularly after confronting it, writing the book, speaking about it, like it's such a joy to say his name and to speak about him because, as you know, there's so much. One of the other things when you asked before about what's so difficult about grief is how like awkward people are about it,
Mm.
and they're scared to talk to you about it when actually you want to talk about the person or you want to talk about your experience, and you can feel people being uncomfortable around you, which as humans we're socialized to fit into the pack, so it's actually very painful
Mm.
for us to pick up on that rejection mentally. So yeah, it's now it's very much more peacefully sitting there within
Mm.
me, which is a lovely place to be in, and that comes, I think, from really sitting with it.
Yeah, and I had to ask because exactly as you say, so many people feel so uncomfortable talking about a subject so tragic as suicide. And so do you still mark important moments that you had with Richard?
Yeah, I definitely find his birthday is always an important day of reflection. And I'm getting more and more involved in certain suicide organizations and
Mm.
charities. And his mum, for example, there was a day where you acknowledge someone who's died by suicide by lighting a candle in the window. And so I did that. And so I'm certainly becoming much more engaged and owning it a bit more. Like, this is part of me, this is part of my experience. Um, but it's still very, very sad to do that as well, and to kind of think about what could have been or how life might have been different.
Mm. Is that something you'll take with you, do you think, moving forwards, in the future, whatever your life turns out to be, you never know, but do you think there'll always be a small part where you will sort of celebrate this life that once was?
Yes, I think so, and I think the dead do continue to live within us,
Mm.
and they never leave us. So yeah.
Well, in honor of Richard, thank you so much for speaking with me about such a important book and such an important story, and just sharing Richard with the rest of the world so that we all know a little bit about him. And we're all lucky in that sense that you've shared that with us. So thank you so much for doing that. And it was painful, but I really hope that you got some kind of cathartic process from it afterwards. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much for reading it and being curious and wanting to speak to me about it. It means a lot. So thank you.